ago. You can introduce yourself first.
Yes, my name is Mark Schumacher. I'm one of the reference librarians here at UNCG, and I have been here, in fact, 40 years.
That's great. So, how would you think about 1960 this period? Like, when you think about 1960, what's your deepest memory?
Well, in the 60s, I began in 1960. I was 12, and at the end of the decade, I was 22. I spent 2 years of that time living in France, but the rest of it I was living in Northern California near San Francisco. And I remember it, I guess, as a good time for my life. I had a good life. I was I was able to go to a very good college, and I enjoyed that. The biggest event, I would say, going on particularly in the second half of the decade, from 64, 65 on, was the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War. A lot of the time during 1965 to 70, I was anti-war. I was opposed to the Vietnam War. I was involved in marches and other kinds of protests about it. At my university, we had rallies and other kinds of gatherings to oppose the war. We were killing many, many people, and the Vietnamese people were not a threat to us. There was nothing they could do. They were not going to sail 8,000 miles and attack California. But for whatever reason, political reasons, I guess, we felt we had to fight this war. And so I and many of my fellow students were opposed to it. It was also in the 60s, the time of the hippie movement. New music was coming along. There were famous singers in the area. There was a very famous woman I never saw. I may or may not have seen her in concert personally, but her name was Janis Joplin. She was a very famous singer. Unfortunately, she died very young, I believe, of a drug overdose, but she was a legendary singer during that period. But I would say that as being a young person, a teenager, and then my early 20s, life was good. I was going to a very good university, learning lots of things. I had, as I say, these 2 years to live in France, once with my mother and my brother in Paris, another time with a group of students from my university, overseas study. And so in many ways, except for the Vietnam War, it was a happy time for me, I would say, yes.
Okay, so how would you think your life in 1960 relate to now? Like, what's the connection with it, you think?
Well, I think during those years, of course, they can help you, of course, become what you will be as an adult from 12 to 20 or so. I think my views on war generally, including the wars we're still fighting as a nation, Afghanistan, Iraq, other places where we continue to fight wars, whether we're doing any good or not, are still in my mind because of my youth. I also like to think that having grown up, I'll go back a little bit, having grown up in Hawaii for 6 years, just before the 60s, I think it gave me a very good sense of how judging people by what they look like, whether black, Asian, whatever, is not a good thing to do. I grew up in Hawaii where about 1/3 of all the people were white. There were Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, some Hawaiians. And we really didn't think about race. We just said, this is my friend Jimmy, or this is my friend Rachel, or whatever. And we didn't say, oh, she's this. Or, we were all just combined happily. And of course, the United States has faced a lot of trouble about race. And at times, I think it's getting better. And then other times, we see police killing African Americans because they did something very minor and nothing dangerous. So I still worry about those kinds of issues, and I think the way I grew up as a child and as a teenager helps shape my view of things like that, yes.
So you are still an anti-war person?
Oh yes, very much. I don't think we should be fighting in Afghanistan. We've been there. I think they say, excuse me, that it's the longest war the United States has ever fought. Longer than the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the World Wars. I think we've been fighting in Afghanistan for 12, 15 years. And are things any better in Afghanistan? I don't think so. My wife, as it turns out, lived for 6 months as a child, long before I knew her, lived in Afghanistan, and she has that same opinion that our being in battles in Afghanistan, losing American soldiers, killing Afghan rebels, whoever they are, it shouldn't be our battle. And so I think I remain quite anti-war, yes.
Okay. Well, thanks for your interviewing. So,
My pleasure. I was glad to be part of your project.
Thank you.